Friday, October 25th, 2019. Hanson Realty's Halloween party at the Magnolia Hotel in downtown St. Louis. Chris showed up late to the party. He was surprised to be here at all. Ever since Sarah, his first wife, had been killed 5 years ago by a drunk driver driving between parties, Chris had hated any Halloween party. For the past 4 years, whenever his now wife Steph asked, he always offered to watch the kids so she could go, but the pain still got in the way. A couple times, she'd made excuses to her boss and stayed home too. This year, Chris decided it was time to stop mourning Sarah and rejoin the party. No pun intended. He didn't tell Steph he was coming because he wanted to surprise her. He had been planning it for months and had even asked one of his cousins to help him with his costume. His cousin was a professional cameraman and had connections in the costume and special effects departments in the movie industry. Chris talked to Corey about getting him a Mandalorian costume. It was a big hit. No one else had any of these costumes on sale yet. The series doesn't premiere on the Disney Channel until next month. But Chris has always been a huge Star Wars fan and fell in love with the character as soon as he saw the very first trailer in August. Luckily, thanks to Corey's connections, he was able to put together a very compelling copy. Chris loved that the helmet would allow him to roam the party anonymously until he could surprise Steph. The party officially started at 7 o'clock, but most people didn't show up until an hour or so later. If the party was okay, it dragged on well past midnight, and since everyone was always having a good time, Steph's boss always rented out a few rooms for the guests so they could get some sleep instead of driving home in a drunken state. Chris and Steph usually got home from work around the same time, usually by 5:30, and this day was no exception. They had a quick dinner together with their 5 children. When they got married, they had agreed that family dinners were very important, and unless very unusual circumstances arose, they always ate together at the dinner table and talked about how the day had gone. Just because Mom left for a party later in the day was not considered an unusual circumstance. Besides, dinner was almost always over by 6:30, and Steph had plenty of time to put on a suit and take an Uber to the party. Just in case, she packed an overnight bag. Her phone beeped that she had a ride. She grabbed the bag and gave Chris a quick kiss. "I love you. Have a good night, everyone. Maybe I'll see you in the morning." And next, Chris watched through the front door as she got into her Uber and then turned to the kids. "Daniel and Caitlin, can I talk to you two for a minute?" Caitlin was the first to respond. "Sure, Dad, what's wrong?" "Well, I didn't want your mom to make a big deal out of it, but I plan to surprise her at her party." Daniel nodded and said, "Really? That's cool. But that means I need the two of you to watch the sisters. It'll probably be an all-nighter." Caitlin smiled. "No problem. It's good that you and Mom have that option. You don't get out that often." Chris smiled back. They really were great kids. "Thanks, guys. I think I should go change." 20 minutes later, he came down in full Mandalorian costume, and it was obvious the kids were impressed. Daniel was the only male in the house, and he was immediately jealous. "Where did you find that? I didn't know there were more like that, and it looks so real. I was expecting something cheaper." "My cousin Corey brought in his special effects specialists, and they custom made it for me. It was a little pricey, but definitely worth it." "Oh, wow. You should let me wear this sometime. It's so cool." "I think we can arrange that, especially after you watch the girls tonight. Behave yourselves tonight. Mom and I will see you tomorrow." Chris decided to drive to the hotel in his car. He knew he would be staying with Steph after the party, and having his own car meant they could go home at their leisure in the morning. He pulled into the large parking lot located on the next street over from the hotel, but decided to leave his bag in his car overnight. He didn't get to the hotel right away and found that the party was being held in the main ballroom. There was a large open space for socializing and dancing, but it was always noisy for those who just wanted to drink and talk. So the room was set up with decorations that allowed for privacy for more private conversations. By the time Chris got there, the party was in full swing. Hanson Realty was a large firm, so there were a lot of employees, as well as spouses, boyfriends, and girlfriends. But the firm also invited other guests, usually contractors who were doing renovations for the firm or frequent clients. Chris's first order of business was to head to a bar for a drink before looking for his wife. He suddenly realized that he hadn't thought this part of his costume through. He didn't want to take off his helmet and carry it around with him all night, because that would definitely ruin the effect. So, as strange as it sounded, he asked the bartender for a draft beer with a straw. There was enough room under his helmet to get the straw to his mouth. He and the bartender had a good laugh about a guy in full armor drinking beer with a straw, but it worked. Then, he went in search of his wife. He wandered around looking for Steph, but couldn't find her on the open part of the floor. When he finally found her in one of the side areas, he suddenly wished he hadn't. Steph was in one of the nooks and crannies, surrounded by coffins and skeletons, in an embrace. In this case, it wasn't some guest, but John, Chris's best friend. Chris knew that nothing would ever be the same. Even if she wasn't really cheating on him, just being in this situation would be breaking the spouse rule, and he would have a hard time trusting her after that. He also knew he should know more about what was going on. He walked past the couple to a nearby room where he could sit down and pretend to sip his drink. At least in this situation, he had the perfect disguise to watch and listen to everything they were doing and saying. Unfortunately, all he could hear at this point was the sounds of entertainment. He pulled out his phone, hoping he could record some of what they were saying. He didn't know if it would work or not, but he figured it was worth a try. "Steph, we can't keep going on like this. You know I want you. Leave Chris and marry me. Be very clear, John. I love you and I want to be with you. But I'm more than that. I have 3 children to think about as well." At those words, Chris's heart tore apart. They had 5 children, even though it was a yours, mine, and ours situation. Steph had 2 children from her first marriage. He had 2 from his first marriage, and now they had 1 in common. But the way she talked about them only having 3 had hurt him more than he'd expected. From the moment they'd met, he'd loved her 2 children as much as he loved his own. To him, they had always been 5 children. A memory flashed through Chris's mind of when he first met Steph almost 5 years ago. He and his daughters had just moved to St. Louis from Kansas City. It was January 2015, and his wife had died in October, shortly before. The first few months after her death were very weighing on Chris, and he knew he needed to make an immediate change while he was still recovering. His daughters, Ashley and Emma, were only 3 and 1 years old at the time, so they didn't even really understand what was going on. Chris's parents lived an hour east of KC, so they could drive to visit them in St. Louis with no problem. He talked to his supervisor, and they arranged a transfer to a plant in suburban Wentzville. Chris was a mechanical engineer and did quality assurance for GM. Moving from the Fairfax, D.C. plant to the Wentzville plant meant moving from inspecting Cadillacs and Malibus to inspecting mid-size pickups and vans. Chris met Steph when he started looking for a new home. Even though they were still relatively young, Chris and Sarah were smart enough to invest in life insurance, so Chris was able to find a nice house in a good neighborhood that wouldn't cause him a long commute to work or keep him away from the girls. Steph had several properties he could visit. They seemed to get along pretty well. And visiting several houses over the course of a few days gave them time to socialize with each other. They became fast friends, sharing stories about their families. Chris and Steph stopped for lunch and coffee as Chris began his story. Steph learned that Chris had first met Sarah at a Halloween party in college when they were sophomores. Neither of them had much experience. Both had dated a little in high school, but both were pretty quiet and shy people. Chris joked that since he was an engineer, it was pretty obvious that he was a nerd, and it pretty much ruined his love life. Sarah wanted to be an elementary school teacher more than anything. She really wanted to teach kindergarten or first grade. Of course, she joked that being a teacher automatically made her a nerd, so she and Chris were perfect for each other. On their third date, they decided to be exclusive. The funny thing is, they didn't really need to make that decision because neither of them had ever dated anyone else in college. That same night, they swore their love and gave each other their virginity. I don't know why I'm sharing all this with you. I've never shared it with anyone else. Steph smiled at him as he continued. I guess I just needed to talk it out. I'm glad you did. Chris continued. For the rest of our college years, we were inseparable. The only time we were apart was during classes. We spent all our evenings together as if we were already married. We'd have dinner together, talk about the day, review what we'd done in class, and then we'd usually go to bed and make love. Eventually, we graduated, and the next month we were married. By the fall, Sarah was pregnant with Ashley. Some people wondered why we had kids so early, but in reality, we had been together for almost 4 years and almost immediately started acting like an old married couple. It seemed like an eternity to us. A couple years later, Emma came along. I'll never forget her birthday. Sarah gave birth on the 3rd anniversary of the day we met. He paused, deep in thought. Steph watched him for a few seconds. How did Sarah die? She saw a shadow run across his face. Never mind. I can see it still hurts a lot. No, it's fine. Again, it seems to help to talk it out. I haven't had anyone to talk to about it. He paused again, seeming to gather courage. It was late October, and we were having a quiet evening at home. Sarah got up to change Emma's diaper and realized it was the penultimate diaper in the house. We were usually so good about always having an extra package. Of course, we knew it wouldn't be enough for all night and the next morning, so Sarah headed to Walmart to buy another package. It was already 10 p.m. I offered, but she said it was her fault for not paying attention to how many we had. She was on her way home when her car was hit by a drunk driver. He was on his way to the pub for Halloween. Ironically, they held it a week early because they didn't want anyone to risk drinking and driving when the kids were trick-or-treating. That's terrible. Yes, my lawyer managed to get a nice compensation from the pubs involved because they published that little bit of information. He convinced them that it proved their guilt. The good news is that I'll be able to use the money to hire a part-time nanny for the girls. I guess that's one good news. I guess, but I'd rather have Sarah back. How about we get back to looking? Let's create some happy memories for you and your girls. After looking around at half a dozen more houses, Chris found one he really liked. It had 5 bedrooms and a large backyard. He figured that eventually each of the girls would have their own room, plus a nice guest room and maybe a home office or playroom. He especially liked the fenced yard, where the girls would have a place to run around when they got older. Well, I guess you won't be needing me anymore. That's not true. You've become a good friend, and I'd really like to see you once in a while just to talk. That would be great. Would you like to have coffee in a day or two? They're letting me stay part-time for the rest of the month so I can get settled in. How about Wednesday in the middle of the day? I won't have to pick up the kids until 4:30 that day. They have after-school clubs that day. That sounds good. Meet me at your office around 1:30? Great. I'll be ready and waiting. But this time you have to tell your story. I don't. I have great kids, but their birth was pretty painful. That's okay. You don't have to share, but I'd really like to know more about my new best friend. Well, since you say so, I guess I'll have to share. Chris picked her up at 1:30 on Wednesday. As soon as she buckled her seatbelt, Steph suggested, "Let's not have coffee. The day is just fine, even if it is the last week of January. Let's go to the Missouri Botanical Garden. We can have coffee there and walk around the garden while we talk. Besides, eventually you'll want to take your girls there, and you need to know all about it." Sounds good. For the first few minutes, they just walked around. Finally, Steph took a deep breath and began. My life has always been a little complicated. My mother was a huge mess. She grew up in a pretty sheltered household and rebelled right after she went to college. She started drinking and sleeping with everyone she could. My birth certificate says, "Father unknown." Wow, I didn't realize they actually did that. Apparently they do sometimes, especially when there's no other option. Anyway, my mom's college career ended abruptly, and she came home to my grandparents to give birth to me. My grandparents are my real parents. During her pregnancy, my mom managed to quit drinking. As my grandmother told me, getting her clean was a real challenge. She became addicted very quickly. What they didn't realize was that she went back to it almost immediately after I was born. Steph was silent for a few seconds to gather her thoughts. The problem was that Mom started selling herself to make money for booze. When she was arrested the second time, my grandparents insisted she go to rehab. They also legally took temporary custody of me. As you can imagine, that didn't change anything. When I was 2 years old, she was arrested for the third time and sent to jail. Then, my grandparents got permanent custody. My mom died in prison a few years after that. I was 4 years old at the time. Her heart weakened after what happened, and it killed her. I'm so sorry, Steph. I mean, it didn't matter because she was never a part of my life. She was always more of a distant aunt who visited me from time to time and was a bit of a mess. But she was still my mother, and it hurt that she didn't love me enough to be with me. Again, I'm sorry. Life was pretty good when you were a kid. Instead of being Daddy's little girl, I was Grandpa's little girl. He was such a wonderful man. I know he spoiled me to death, but we had a great time. I love my grandmother, but she doesn't compare to my grandfather, and I's love. What happened? He had a heart attack right before my 18th birthday. Like you and Sarah, it was the week before Halloween. I'm sorry. I guess he and I are in the same club that no one wants to join. Yeah. Anyway, I was lost for a couple months, looking for someone to love like my grandfather loved me. Unfortunately, I found Mark. We dated a few times in junior high and high school. As we got older, I got pregnant. Mark and I were married a week later at the courthouse, with only his parents and my grandmother as witnesses. We lived with my grandmother for about 6 months. In September, Daniel was born, and the three of us moved into a small apartment. Mark worked for a construction company building houses. A little less than 2 years later, Caitlin was born. Things were good for a while. I mean, things were tight, but I thought we were a happy little family. It wasn't the best way to start life, but I really loved Mark, and our kids were great. So what happened? Shortly before Caitlin's 5th birthday, Mark just left. He didn't say anything. He just went to work that morning as usual. I took the kids to school as usual and went to my job. That fall, I started selling real estate. At the end of the day, I picked up the kids and went home to make dinner, but Mark never came home. I made some excuse for the kids and sent them to bed at the usual time, and then I started calling a few of Mark's friends. I hadn't heard from him. Then I called his boss, but he said Mark hadn't even shown up for work that morning. Really? At that point, I started to panic and called my grandmother. She called Mark's parents, but they hadn't heard anything either. The next day, I went to withdraw some money from the ATM to buy the kids dinner, but found that Mark had taken all but $100. That's when I called the police. They said there wasn't much they could do, but they filled out a missing persons report. I'm just shocked. How could someone do that? Eventually, I did find out. About 3 months later, the police found him. They arrested him in Texas. He killed a couple he was robbing. All he got from them was $218. Of course, in Texas, murder is taken very seriously. He was quickly convicted and is serving 2 life sentences. The only good part of the deal is that the divorce was pretty straightforward. I wanted to be completely free of him, so my lawyer made him give up any claim to the children. He'll never be able to see them anyway, and this way, I won't have to talk to him about anything else. I understand why you want to be free of him after this, but I still don't see how he could ever give up his children. That's the thing. He never wanted them or me. He blames us for stealing his life from him. Never mind that he was the one who pressured me to get on with it. I mean, I admit that after losing my grandfather, I really wanted someone to love me, but I was still able to take responsibility for the lives I brought into this world. Mark never could. Anyway, I didn't date anyone for over 4 years after that, and even after that it was sporadic. No one I know wants to inherit a family, especially one with grown children, and while I'm a bit of a loner, I won't sleep with anyone who won't agree to a total package deal. In other words, I haven't been with anyone in about 7 years. I can totally respect that. I think I have a long way to go for the same reason. I don't think I'll ever find someone to replace Sarah, and I'm in no hurry to try. It's good that we met. We can lean on each other until we're ready to move on. In the meantime, we can continue to raise our kids and have coffee once in a while. After that, Chris and Steph got together to chat about once a week. A little over a month later, one of the guys at Chris's work invited him to go out for drinks and a game of pool. Chris was putting off the offer because he didn't want to impose on his part-time nanny. She worked until he was home by 6 every day. Chris had mentioned it to Steph during their weekly coffee, and she had quickly offered to watch his daughters so he could go for a walk. He'd been hesitant at first, but decided it was time to make at least one more friendship. As soon as he dropped the kids off at her house, he was greeted by Daniel and Caitlin. He was surprised at how polite they were, as well as how eager they were to meet Ashley and Emma. Of course, Emma was only a year and a half old, so she didn't realize what was going on, but Ashley had very quickly latched on to the two older children. The age difference was pretty significant, but Daniel had brought some of his Legos to play with, and Caitlin had brought some books to read to the girls. Chris watched them play for a few minutes and then thanked Steph for doing it. He told her that he wouldn't be long, but she insisted that he take as many as he wanted. Chris and John spent about 3 hours at the bar talking and playing pool. In fact, Chris only had a glass and a half of beer, but he had a great evening socializing with his new friend. Over the next few years, they got together regularly at the bar to shoot pool or throw darts. During the warmer months, they played golf about once every 2 weeks. By the end of February, Chris and Steph had moved on to having family dinners at one of their homes at least a couple times a week. By April, they decided that they were dating by default, although they did nothing more than hug and kiss. One May week, Chris asked Steph to take the kids out for a Friday and Saturday night. His parents were going to be visiting for a few days and were willing to watch all the kids. Chris wanted to give Steph a romantic weekend away. It was their first time sleeping together. Over the next few months, they continued to spend more and more time together, though both were hesitant to take the next step. Before they knew it, it was October. Steph's firm was having their annual party, and she wanted to bring Chris along. It would be their first time meeting coworkers as a couple. Unfortunately, it was the same date that Sarah had died. It had only been a year, so Chris knew he wouldn't be good company. Steph understood everything, but knew she had to show up at least briefly. Chris practically insisted that she go and watch her kids while she was there. He knew it was required by all the staff, and after all, they had met, but hadn't made a firm commitment yet. Steph left, but she managed to get back to his house by 9:30, and they spent the rest of the evening together. A month later, Chris hosted Thanksgiving dinner at his house, although Steph largely helped cook. They also invited Steph's grandmother and Chris's parents. It was a wonderful dinner, and when they were done eating, everyone was talking around the table. Steph was a little surprised that Daniel and Caitlin didn't ask to be excused to play on their phones like they usually did, but sat in their seats with goofy grins as if they knew some secret. Chris had told them the secret the day before. It was actually more of a question, but they both readily agreed. Chris took Steph's hand at the table to get her attention. A year ago, I couldn't have imagined it would be like this. Here we are sitting around the table with the whole family and celebrating Thanksgiving. But I can envision one more thing that will make me even more thankful. Steph, will you marry me? Will you make this family whole? As soon as he began to speak, Steph burst into tears. When he proposed, she was suddenly dazed and unable to speak. But she began nodding her head vigorously, trying to hold her hand up so Chris could slip the ring on her finger. He barely had time to put the ring on her hand before she jumped into his lap, hugging and kissing him. Almost as quickly, she began communicating with her grandmother and his mother, planning the wedding she had missed years ago. The next few months passed quickly. Steph and her children moved into the house just before Christmas. Daniel and Caitlin had their own room. Ashley and Emma shared a room the entire time they lived there. The plans for the wedding continued. Because Steph's first marriage had ended, her grandmother insisted on a prenup. Chris didn't think anything of it, but he understood why Steph's grandmother wanted one. Basically, If a marriage dissolved due to abandonment or infidelity, the injured party got the house, primary custody of the children, and 70% of the property gained during the marriage. Anything gained during the marriage would stay with each person. This was mostly small savings, their separate retirement accounts, and the balance of Sarah's insurance and settlement money. Chris and Steph signed their signatures, and neither of them ever brought it up again. October came, and it was time for the Halloween party again. Like last year, Chris said he wouldn't be good company and excused himself. True, he said he'd be happy to watch the kids so Steph could go and have a good time. She thought about it, but decided it was more important to spend time with her new family than to go to a party. She explained this to her boss, who was more than happy to excuse her. He even told her that he respected her for insisting on going, because to him, family was really more important. After all, he was a man who had 4 children and 6 grandchildren. Chris and John still saw each other from time to time, but because Chris had started a family, the men went to bars to play pool and darts less and less often. Instead, John began to be invited to spend more time with his family. He came over for dinners and barbecues. Of course, Steph often tried to set him up with one of her single co-workers. The family continued to socialize. Daniel and Caitlin were happy to have a father and spent as much time with him as possible. The following fall was the first major change in the family. In September, on Daniel's birthday, Elizabeth was born. Even though he was a teenager, he was thrilled to hold and care for little Libby. He made no secret of the fact that he would be her protector for life. A month later, when it was time for the annual party, there was no doubt that Steph would stay in the family. After all, she was still on maternity leave. Chris snapped back to the present upon hearing Steph. He furtively glanced at the couple in the next alcove and saw them kissing. He tried to nonchalantly bring his phone over to take a quick picture of the couple. Their chatter told Chris more about what had happened. "Don't you wish you hadn't wasted all that time on those sluts you used to date?" "Oh God, Steph. I didn't actually like any of them at all. I only dated them to distract Chris from the fact that when I first met you all those years ago, I immediately fell in love with you. I rarely went to bed with them, and if I did, it was only because I felt so strongly about you that I needed a release. I have to admit that over the last year when I've entertained Chris, I've usually thought about you. Do you still love him? Do you really want to know? You're not jealous, are you?" she teased. "Honestly, I'm not sure I loved him. I mean, I care about him, and I was sorry about what happened to his wife. But I really wanted someone to help me raise my kids. I guess in a way I understand what Mark was upset about. Being pregnant at 18 stole my life too. I love being a mom, but I missed out on so much." "I understand. I've slept with a lot of women over the years, but you've had what, 3? "Yes, I've only had you as my 3rd, and you're by far the best lover I've ever had. I was the only one Mark was with, and I'm only Chris's 2nd, so neither of them know as much as you do about what really turns a woman on. I guess I can forgive you for all those women, since it made you a better lover for me. Come here, sweetheart. I'll show you what kind of lover I can be." "Oh, John, maybe we should move this to my room?" exclaimed Steph, somewhat panting. "That sounds wonderful, but we mustn't be seen leaving together. Give me the key and I'll go upstairs. You do a little socializing, make your excuses to your boss, and meet me in my room in 15 minutes or so." "Sounds good to me. It's room 812. See you in a few minutes, lover." "Go, hot little minx." Both were oblivious to the seething, broken Mandalorian, listening to their conversation. A plan began to form in his mind. He stood up and quickly made his way to the front desk. He hated to take off his helmet when someone could see it, but he needed the desk to give him another room key. He simply explained that his wife had both keys and he couldn't find her at the party, but he really needed to get into their room. Surprisingly, he only had to show his ID. Since the credit card Steph used to book the room also had his name on it, he was happily given a new room key. Now all he had to do was wait about 30 minutes for the party in room 812 to begin. He put his helmet back on in case he ran into anyone he knew. Half an hour passed. He walked quietly to the room and tried to listen through the door to see if it was time. He wasn't sure, but from the sound of it, the time was right. He took off his helmet and placed it outside the door. He didn't need to keep anything extra in his hands, and he was afraid he might drop it if he saw what he expected to see. He pulled out his phone and opened the camera app, then swiped the keycard across the lock and heard the door click shut. Carefully, as quietly as possible, he opened the door and stepped into the room. It was obvious that Steph had done her best and gotten a suite. Through the open French doors, he could see the bedroom to the left. However, even though he was not in the same room, he slowly closed the main door behind him. He was afraid that if it closed loudly, they would get spooked and bolt before he could get a clear shot. Nothing could have prepared him for what he saw on the bed. John was no different from him. He was just shocked to see his favorite woman having fun with another man. They were so engrossed in each other that they didn't even notice he was watching them from the living room. After recovering from the shock, Chris started filming the video, taking multiple shots at the same time. He didn't say anything. He just sadly turned and walked out of the room. As he walked outside, he didn't make sure the door closed loudly, but figured they were so busy they probably wouldn't notice. He picked up his helmet from the floor, put it on to disguise himself again, and quickly headed for the stairs. In the room, Steph and John heard the door close. After staring for a few seconds, John still stood up and walked to the door. He didn't open it, but looked through the peephole. Seeing nothing, he shrugged and went back into the bedroom. I don't know. There's no one there. It must have been the next room. It just sounded like it was our door. Weird. Chris walked quickly to the car, finally taking off his helmet. But as soon as he buckled his seatbelt, his emotions came rushing out. He knew he loved Steph, maybe not as much as he loved Sarah, but it was still a reality. And now he was shattered. In many ways, it was worse than losing Sarah. She hadn't chosen death. She had been taken from him. Steph, on the other hand, had chosen to betray him. Several times while driving home, he realized he was distracted and not paying attention to the road. He was lucky he managed to make it home alive. Leaving his helmet and overnight bag in the car, he made his way through the garage door and dirty room into the kitchen. He almost bumped into Daniel, and it made him slow down. Dad, what's wrong? I wasn't expecting you home today. Chris just stared at him dumbly. Dad, you're scaring me. Where's Mom? Is she with you? Chris couldn't say anything, but he started crying again. Daniel pulled him to a chair in the kitchen and sat him down before he collapsed. He took a glass and filled it with water, setting it on the table in front of Chris. Unfortunately, his father continued to sit there in shock until Daniel said, "Let's get you out of that armor." He pulled the clasps and began to remove the various parts of the suit, relieved that it was designed to be easily worn over a t-shirt and tights. Come on, Dad, talk to me. What's got you so upset? Chris took a deep breath and said, barely loud enough to be heard, "Your mother is cheating on me." Daniel stopped what he was doing and froze for a second. Are you sure? I saw it. I took a picture of it. Who is she with? With John. Shit. Daniel. Sorry, it came out, but that doesn't make it any less appropriate. I don't like it when you use that kind of language anyway. Daniel laughed lightly. Chris looked at him with a puzzled expression on his face. Daniel explained, Well, you have to admit it's kind of funny. Your life is falling apart, and your first thought is how to get me to be more polite. It was Chris's turn to chuckle. Yeah. So what are you planning on doing? Not that I have much of a choice. From what I can see, this has been going on for months at least. Not to mention I've heard her say she never really loved me. She was just looking for a father figure for you and Caitlin. He wiped away the tears on his cheeks again. And now she's going to leave me and take you, Caitlin and Libby. Not if I have anything to say about it. He took his seat at the table. Daniel, she's your mother. I know that and I love her, but for the past few years I feel like she's resentful of me. Like I stole her life from her. Chris wanted to tell Daniel he was wrong, But he'd heard Steph say pretty much the same thing earlier that evening. Even if that were true, I know your mom still loves you. In her own way, but that doesn't mean she doesn't resent me. From what I've heard her say about me, I can't say there isn't truth in what you're saying. They both stared at the table in front of them. Anyway, I guess I'll have to get a lawyer to decide how we split everything up. Your mother will be home tomorrow morning. I think I'll take you kids to Grandma's first thing. I wish I could be here, Dad. I know, and don't worry, you'll get your say. But I think I'd like to meet her alone first. It might be a little ugly, and I wouldn't want the girls around in that case. I understand, Dad. And for that matter, I guarantee things will be awful when I meet her. I really can't believe she did this to us. Wait a minute, Daniel. She's cheating on me. She told John she has kids, so I know she loves you. Maybe she does, but she's still destroying this family, and that includes all 7 of us. He thought for a moment. Actually, it's more than that. I love all 3 of my grandparents, and if Mom plans to keep you, how often will I get to see your parents? Probably never. And that's very unacceptable to me. Daniel, I know I've only known you for a few years, but it's things like this that make me love you even more. But I also legally adopted you, so I'll have visitation rights, and I promise you I'll make sure you spend as much time as you want with your grandparents. Thanks, Daddy. You know I love you too. What do you say we try to sleep in? You help me take your sisters to Grandma's in the morning, and then we'll see what happens. Chris had no idea what kind of night Daniel had had, but he didn't sleep at all. It seemed amazing to him that he could be so sad and so angry at the same time. He really did love Steph, and to find out that it was all an act on her part was heartbreaking. The next morning he was in the kitchen, making pancakes for the kids before taking them to Steph's grandmother's house. Suddenly, he was hugged from behind by Caitlin. "Oh, Daddy, I'm so sorry. What are we going to do?" And Chris turned to hug his 14-year-old adopted daughter. "I guess your brother told you?" He looked at her tear-drenched face as she nodded. "Just know that I love you, and I'm going to protect you from all of this as much as I can. Nothing will ever stop me from loving you." How could she do this to us? I don't know, sweetheart, but we're going to be okay no matter what, okay? She still clung to him, but nodded her head. You and Daniel didn't say anything to Ashley and Emma, did you? I wanted to, but Daniel told me to wait. He's right. I need to deal with your mother first. Then we can talk to the other girls. After breakfast, I want to take all 5 of you to Grandma's for a while so I can talk to your mom about what needs to happen. Daddy, isn't there some way to make this go away? I wish there was, but after what I saw and heard last night, there's no way I can get over it, and there's no way I can ever trust her again. Caitlin said nothing, but gave another subtle nod of her head. Why don't you help make breakfast for everyone? You work on the pancakes for a couple minutes. I'll call your grandmother and see if it's okay to bring you over to her place. As she started cooking, she was able to recover a bit, and Chris went out into the living room to call Steph's grandmother. He explained that he needed some alone time with Steph, and she replied that she would be happy for the kids to come over for a little while. She was 80 years old, but was still very active and loved watching the kids. Around 9:30, all the children were fed, washed, dressed, loaded into the van, and arrived at Catherine's house. She enthusiastically greeted the children, listened to their updates on what they were doing at school, and then sent them to the family room to watch one of the many Disney movies she had on hand. Ashley, Emma, and Libby went off to another room while Daniel and Caitlin stayed back. Kids, why don't you watch the younger girls while I talk to your father for a few minutes? Actually, Grandma Kate, we want to talk about what's going on too. Catherine looked at Chris, but he didn't say anything back. She could see the sadness and anger in his eyes. Okay, Caitlin, you'll go and make sure the movie is going right, and then you can come back. But I think I'm going to need you both to step in a bit, because I suspect your younger sisters don't know what's going on yet, right? Yes, ma'am. Okay, Chris, let's sit down at the kitchen table away from prying eyes, and you can tell me what's really going on. Over the next few minutes, Chris recounted just about everything he had heard and seen the night before. Catherine didn't react too much, but because the children were listening to her, he didn't allow himself any extra words. Still, he could see the tears on Caitlin's face as he described the evening. So, do you have actual proof of all this? I didn't actually listen to or watch any of it, but I tried to record their conversation in the ballroom, and I definitely videotaped them and took pictures of them in the room. How they didn't notice me, I'll never know, but it was a suite and I never went into the bedroom. I just took pictures through the open door. Next question, what do you want to do? Caitlin asked me the same question this morning. I can never trust her, and she basically said she doesn't really love me, so I guess we'll break up. I just don't want to go broke in a divorce, and I need to make sure the visitation is fair. Chris, have you forgotten that I made you sign a prenup? He looked up with a puzzled expression on his face. You're clearly the injured party. That means you'll have primary custody, the house, and most of the assets. Daniel and Caitlin straightened upon hearing those words from Catherine. Does that mean we get to stay with Daddy? I don't know, Daniel. Since Chris is only your foster parent, I'm not sure what the court will say. But I do know that in situations like this, the older children sometimes have the right to decide who they want to live with. Ashley and Emma will obviously live with you, Chris as the biological father, and Libby falls under the terms of the prenup. Daniel and Caitlin, on the other hand, will have legal issues. Daniel didn't hesitate. I want to live with Dad and all my sisters. Me too. I choose Daddy. Well, when the time comes, we'll make sure the judge knows about it. But that's still to come. You may change your mind before then. Daniel and Caitlin shook their heads negatively. Well, we'll see. We talked some more about the immediate plans, but then Chris decided it was time to go home and wait for Steph. He expected her around noon because that would be shortly after the usual departure time, but barely had he walked in the door at 11 when a text from Steph arrived on his phone. Having a long chat with one of the girls, she's contemplating breaking up with her boyfriend. Needs support. I'll be home for dinner. Love, Steph. Chris thought, yeah, sure. Why do I think you're the girl who's contemplating breaking up? He typed, do whatever you want. We'll talk when you get home. If she noticed he didn't sign off with love, Chris, she didn't say anything back. He was pretty sure they'd gone to John's to do some more fooling around. He decided he had a little time to check his notes and see what he had caught. He uploaded them to the cloud and then sat down at his laptop to listen to the recordings made in the ballroom. The microphone picked up quite a bit of extraneous noise, but he could still hear the two lovers discussing their feelings for each other and for him. As for the video and pictures, he only glanced at them to make sure they were recorded correctly. He didn't feel like watching it again at all. It was painful enough for him to see it live. Watching it again only pissed him off even more. Since he had a few hours to spare, he decided to start collecting Steph's clothes and personal items that clearly belonged to her. Anything he thought he might need, he deliberately left alone. That would have to be dealt with in the settlement agreement. It didn't take long to fill the suitcase. He made sure to leave the one he always used when traveling. No sense in giving her this one. Luckily, they had several plastic containers to store things in. Many of them were already filled with her clothes. She had spent the weekend the day before changing out her summer and winter clothes. Each time he filled a container or suitcase, he carried it out to the garage and stacked it along the wall. Standing there, he realized he had a problem. Steph usually drove the Traverse, and he could easily fit them all in when they went somewhere. He had a Silverado truck, a car seat for Libby, and a booster for Emma. But if Daniel and Caitlin went their own way and stayed with him, he wouldn't be able to fit them and all 5 kids in his cab. Maybe it was time to buy a Tahoe. He could keep the truck to haul stuff, but an SUV would be better for the family. He glanced at his watch. Remarkably, it was still a little over an hour. He called the elevator to take him to the Chevy dealership. With any luck, he could return with a new car before Steph got home. 3 hours later, he was home with a brand new Tahoe. Thanks to the fact that he was a GM employee and the fact that he was willing to pay cash, he was able to get a favorable offer. He transferred money out of their savings, but decided it didn't matter. Since he was to receive 70% of their estate, He decided that the new car would be considered part of that estate. He loaded Steph's things into the Traverse and put it in the parking lot on the street in front of the house. Then he pulled the new Tahoe into the garage and moved the booster seats from the truck into the SUV. By then, it was about 5 o'clock, and he figured Steph would be home soon. He was somewhat relieved. Being busy all day kept him from dwelling on the pain of realizing his marriage was over. He was just pouring himself a glass of iced tea when the front door opened. "Honey, why is my car parked outside and why is it full of boxes and bags?" "Just because you're moving." "What are you talking about? Why would I be moving?" "Well, I've decided that since you really want to be with John, our marriage is over and you're leaving. I packed up all your clothes and most of the other things that clearly belong to you and loaded them into your car. Anything else you want, we'll probably have our lawyers handle." "Oh my God. How did you find out? What do you mean by lawyers?" "Well, my dear, when people get divorced, they usually have lawyers." He paused for a second and went out into the family room. He returned very quickly, carrying his helmet in his hands. "As for how I found out, I was there." "Oh my God. You were right there with us. I'm so sorry you had to find out that way." She certainly didn't seem shocked that he'd brought up the divorce. "I guess we have nothing more to say. You're obviously not as upset as I am, so I think what I heard last night is true. You never really loved me." "Oh, Chris, I care about you and I'm drawn to you because of what happened with Sarah. But no, I don't think I've ever really loved you." "Well, that's just great. I'm a really happy person. Maybe it's time for you to just leave." "Wait, why do I have to leave? I love this house. When I showed it to you, I was hoping I could live here and keep it. Why don't you just move out? I'll need it to raise my kids." "Steph, you're forgetting two very important things. First, this is my house. I bought it before we even started dating. Sure, you showed it to me and probably hoped to live here, but it's not yours. We never changed the deed to put your name on it, so it definitely belongs only to me. Second, as for the kids, you forgot that your grandmother insisted we sign a prenup. Maybe you thought it was just to protect you. Well, sorry to burst your bubble, but it's to protect both of us. You cheated on me, so I get the house, I get the property, I get the kids, and you get to walk away." "But you don't have any proof that we cheated. You just heard us talking." "Indeed. You're going to try to use the 'you have no proof' card. You may think you've planned this so carefully, but you really haven't. The number 812, right? Nice room, but you didn't pay attention to who else was in the room. All I had to do was show my ID at the counter and I got another key card. Do you want to see the video?" Steph was beginning to show shock. "You were actually in the room? Was that really our door that closed?" "It was when I was leaving. I came in pretty quietly, not that you both noticed. But when I left, I didn't care if you heard me. I guess it didn't matter much, since you spent all night and all today with him." "I'm so sorry, Chris. I never meant to hurt you." "Well, you did. It hurts a lot." For a few moments, they both stood like that. Chris stared at her intently. Steph couldn't look him in the eye. Her attention was fixed on the ground. "I think it's time for you to leave. I'm going to see a lawyer on Monday to start the process." Steph nodded her head sadly. As she headed for the door, Chris heard her snort a couple times. Any other time, he would have hugged her and comforted her. But not today. He even felt a little angry, like he'd been manipulated the whole time he'd known her. "The kids are at your grandmother's. I'm going to head over there in a few minutes to bring them home. If you want to talk to them for a few minutes while they're there, that would be fine." She turned to him and he could clearly see her tear-drenched face. "Thank you," she said in a breaking voice. "You might want to recover a bit before you get there." She nodded and walked out the door. Chris sipped his tea and called Catherine to let her know what had happened. He told her that Steph was probably on her way there now to see the kids. He would give her a half hour to get there, and then he would be there to take the kids home. Catherine sighed. "Sounds good. We've already eaten. Daniel and Caitlin have been pretty low-key all day, and the younger girls are starting to realize that. They're all pretty quiet." "No surprise there." So what's next? I spent part of the day gathering her clothes and personal belongings and loading them into the car. Where she's going to live, I don't know, and I'm not sure I care. She can stay with me for a while if she wants to. I don't know if she'll want to do that or if she'll just move in with John. I think she spent all day with him. She didn't get to the house until around 5. If she wants to see the kids, I'd rather it happen at your place. I don't want them around him, at least not right now. I think if they are together, the kids will have to spend time with him. Right now, I think I feel more betrayal from his side than hers. It sounds weird, I guess. I'm not sure I realize that. I don't either, actually. I guess just because he spent so much time talking about other women he was dating and introducing us to them, there's no way I expected my friend to start stalking my wife. Okay, I understand. But her betrayal was really just as deep. I mean, she told you all those years ago that she loved you, and now you find out she didn't really mean it. Yeah, that hurts. Well, I'd better talk to Daniel and Caitlin before she gets here. I'll ask them to be a little polite, especially in front of the younger girls. Thank you. I hope they don't make a grand scene. It wouldn't do anyone any good right now. Chris stood around for about an hour before heading over to Catherine's house in the new Tahoe. To say the kids were surprised is an understatement. When they got back to the house, the older kids hid in their rooms, leaving Chris alone to put the girls to bed. He grinned at the thought that he'd better get used to this. This would be the new normal. Things were developing just as Chris had expected. His lawyer was thrilled with the prenup. It was drawn up fairly rigidly, and he didn't expect any problems. He was a little surprised that Daniel and Caitlin wanted to stay living with Chris. As the adoptive parent, Chris had visitation rights, but this was the first time in the attorney's practice that the adopted children wanted to stay with the adoptive parent rather than the birth parent. It was this part of the case that upset Steph the most. She broke down completely when the children told her they no longer wanted to live with her. Her emotions were mixed. On the one hand, she regretted how her life would have turned out if she hadn't gotten pregnant at 18, or the fact that she had 2 children before she could legally have a glass of wine. On the other hand, she loved her children dearly, and the thought of having them with her part-time was killing her. She also regretted what she had done to Chris. She cared about him, but marrying him probably wasn't really fair to him. They were both single and probably looking for a missing parent for their children. But was that a reason to get married? Chris spent the next few days talking to the kids, emphasizing the importance of them not pulling away from their mom completely. I understand that you're mad at her for this, but she's your mother, and before all of this, I don't think she ever thought about the fact that you might not choose to be with her. Please don't destroy her. I can't live with her anymore, but that doesn't mean I don't care about her. Yes, Dad, I realize that, but it just pisses me off when I'm around her. Maybe I should seek counseling for all of us. Maybe for your mother, too. Maybe it would help us all get over the resentment and adjust to the new reality of living in 2 different homes. I just wish she would see all of us kids as one family. I love all 4 of my sisters equally. It annoys me that my mom doesn't want to spend time with Ashley and Emma, and the girls don't understand why she's so cold to them. If she keeps this up, she's going to push Caitlin and I away too. I'll do my best to make her realize that. Another reason for all of us to get counseling. The next few weeks went about as well as could be expected. They received counseling in various combinations. Chris, Daniel, and Caitlin received individual counseling. Daniel and Caitlin were surprised at how much anger they still carried within them over being abandoned by their biological father. Their anger at their mother grew partly out of that. Chris needed to work through his issues surrounding the loss of Sarah and Steph. To learn how to function as 2 families now, the 4 older children met with a counselor and Chris one week and Steph the next week. Everyone trusted that Libby would adjust to what her siblings were doing, and she loved having Grandma Kate alone with her. In the end, counseling helped them realize that the idea of shared custody was in the best interest of all the children. No matter what, the 5 children would live together, no matter what house they stayed in. For the time being, that meant they would be living in Chris's home most of the time. When Chris packed her things, Steph stayed at her grandmother's house for a few days at first. John quickly convinced her to move into his apartment. It was a nice place, and Steph was the realtor who sold it to him. Unfortunately, the apartment only had 2 bedrooms, so there was no place for the kids to stay. The other problem was that once Steph and John started living together full-time, their relationship started to change. Anyone who has ever been in a relationship knows that the beginning of a relationship brings a lot of joy. But once a couple starts living together, the flaws in the relationship become more noticeable. It wasn't long before the couple started having serious disagreements over nothing. Steph took it very hard. John was becoming more and more like Mark. He was almost expressing regret that he wasn't living the bachelor life. Part of Steph was beginning to realize that maybe she had made a mistake. Certainly, life with Chris was more peaceful. They did feel comfortable as an older couple. With the children coming along, there wasn't much excitement as there would have been if she was still single. True, she saw the kids for a few hours each weekday. Since there was no room in John's apartment, they had arranged for Steph to pick up the kids from the time school ended until 8 o'clock in the evening each weekday. Chris would leave them overnight and on weekends. If Steph and John got a bigger apartment, they planned to alternate weeks. John and Steph had a big fight about not being able to do anything on weekday evenings because of the kids. Steph reminded him that he knew she was one with the kids, and that was an integral part of parenthood. After the second week, John found a way to stay late at work. Steph could smell the beer in his breath and knew he was avoiding the kids. Regret appeared more and more often in Steph's thoughts. One Tuesday night, dropping the kids off at Chris's house, she asked him for a minute. "I need a favor." "What can I do for you?" "I need you and the kids to help me move into my grandmother's house this weekend." "Why? Is there something I need to worry about? Is John doing okay with the kids?" "Well, let's just say that living together full-time doesn't quite live up to the fantasies I had in mind. John and I are breaking up." "I'm sorry." "Do you think we have a chance to start over?" "To be honest, no. I think we can be friendly with each other, but I don't think I can trust you again. Listening to you talk the other night just killed that part of me. Even if we started over, I'd always wonder if you really feel something for me, or if you're just looking for a father for our kids." "I understand. I don't like it, but I understand." She hesitated for a second. "You know, for the record, I did have feelings for you. I'm not such a good actress. I mean, I know what I said to John that night, and to be honest, what I've said to him on many nights, but I don't think what I said was true. My therapist and I have discussed this a lot. We think I was just taken over by the new relationship, and to avoid feeling guilty, I minimized the feelings I really had for you. Yes, I understand how that could have happened, but it would still be very hard for me to get over it. Not to mention that my therapist and I think I really need to spend some time alone. She thinks I was afraid of being alone with 2 small children and haven't worked through my grief. I need to do that and work on forming my own identity. In other words, I can go out and spend time with friends, but I need to refrain from new relationships for a while. There's no need to rush things, and since the kids don't distract me, I don't think that will be a problem." Steph nodded her head, looking a little sad. "So, we're continuing what we've been doing with the kids, only we're moving in with your grandmother instead of John." "Yeah, for now. I might start looking for a place to live. It would be nice to keep the kids for a longer period of time. It'll be a while before I can afford it. The prenup really screwed me up in that regard." Epilogue. Steph found a decent 4-bedroom house about 6 blocks from Chris's house. It was close enough that they could walk in good weather, and there were no issues with the kids' schools. Steph, for her part, had earned a reputation as an ice queen. She rarely dated, and when she did, she was sure to make sure that the children came first for her. The biggest change came with Chris a few years later. When Libby went into 2nd grade and most of the parents went to a meet the teacher night at her school, Chris was fascinated by his daughter's teacher, Miss Emily Carter. Not a week later, they ran into each other at the grocery store and talked for 20 minutes next to baskets of onions in the produce department. That same weekend, they went on their first date, and over the next few months they were together more and more, and the following summer they were married. Daniel and Caitlin were in college by then, but Chris somehow managed to keep bringing families together. Emily was only a couple of years younger than Chris, and her first husband, Jackson, had died in a helicopter accident while serving in the military. The couple had twin daughters who were just Emma and Libby's ages. Chris wasn't the least bit surprised that Daniel quickly assigned his room to his new foster sisters, Isabella and Sophia. In the end, Chris had no regrets whatsoever. His life had been difficult, but in the end, he had the unconditional love of his children. What more did he need? The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.